provide contact information. I will leave cards outside next to the sandwiches. And please do not hesitate to contact us. Thanks.
Is on? Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Alice, for the introduction. As I said, my name is Chris Cermak. I'm with Handelsblatt Global. For those of you who don't know, that's the English language edition of Handelsblatt, the German business magazine. I'm jumping in on short notice, but happy to be here, and thank you for the invite. I thought I might start. I know there was a brief introduction of the panelists, but perhaps I could just ask all of you to very briefly talk about what your interest in this topic is, what you've, perhaps just a minute or so, just what your interest in this topic is, and what you've been doing in a way over the last month or so, or perhaps since the beginning of the year particularly, to think about this.
Yeah, I start. Yeah, and during the last years, the GDPR was like one of the main focuses of my working life, because I led a campaign for the GDPR for the German NGO Campact, and more than 100,000 people from Germany said, yes, we want a stricter privacy enforcement here in Europe. And that's why I followed the long process of the GDPR, and I'm very happy that finally this regulation made it to get into force soon, next month. And my experience with some topics which are covered by the GDPR are also connected with my research for my book. I spent a lot of time requesting data from all kinds of companies where my private data is stored, and for some companies it took more than half a year to provide me my personal data, and I'm very hopeful, or I'm hoping that this will change with new privacy legislation in Europe.
Okay. I usually work with governments dealing with security questions. So what kind of security governments needs to protect their data. But on the other hand, I'm dealing with privacy for the last 15 years and occasionally talking about that over the last couple of years. And for me, one of the most important changes I have seen over the last few months is that when I talked about privacy 3 or 4 years ago on events, that was the minute where people left the room to have coffee or started to text on their phones, and all of a sudden people come to events because of privacy, which is extremely interesting. And so I'm touring around Europe currently, talking about privacy and GDPR nearly every week, and talking to customers, especially in Germany, Austria at the moment, smaller, bigger companies, and how they can prepare themselves and how we can help them.
Great. So yeah, I'm also very happy to be here, and personally I think I've been drawn into that subject a little bit. So in my earlier life, I was a physicist. I worked in academia, and when I finished my PhD, like many physicists, I said, okay, there are no jobs in physics and industry, so what do I do? Of course, we do something with data science. So we started a small data science agency in Berlin and tried to help customers and companies working with their data, both from users and from machines. And then when we were doing that, we saw that, yeah, you can really do very interesting things with data, but of course, there are also a lot of problems concerning the privacy and what you actually are the consequences of what things you're predicting and how you can influence people with that. And so I started thinking more and more about this. Later, I also started to work for the German cybersecurity organization, where I not only learned that you can do powerful things with data, but that it's also for many people quite easy to steal your data. So it's also influenced my thinking in the ways how we can secure data and keep it from being accessed in ways that we don't want to. And I think right now with the GDPR, we are in a really interesting situation, because for the first time we will have more universal framework for companies that they can use in order to decide how they can use data and what they can and cannot do with that. but there's also like a lot of ambiguity still. So like many companies that we're working with, they don't know what they have to do, and even like the regulators themselves, often they have not a clear idea what should actually a given paragraph or a given article mean. So I think like the coming years will be very interesting, both in terms of like user rights. So I think we as users, we will get more possibilities to actually know what is going on with our data and maybe get more control over that. But also for companies, because it will make it on one hand clearer what they can do with data, but there will be a lot of challenges, especially for, I would say, the larger companies that have already a large IT organization and maybe store data in a way that makes it more difficult to handle with the new regulation. So.
Okay, thank you very much for that. There's three very interesting different backgrounds here on the panel. I'd like to start maybe just briefly. Everyone knows what we're talking about here, but the GDPR is coming into force in May 25th, as we all know. There's been about 2 years for it to be implemented by companies. It was already passed in 2016. It's been in the works for about 4 years, as I understand. It's worth noting this is the directive that has been updated. The last time it was updated, as I understand, was 1995. But that's not to say that in Europe particularly there haven't been privacy concerns, legislation enforcement, arguably particularly more than in the US. And the one other thing to add, of course, all of what we're talking about, as much as we want to talk about the very technical aspects or what companies can expect, it's fair to say that this is happening in the aftermath of the Facebook scandal. A lot of you may have watched Zuckerberg's testimony. So I'd like to put some of the questions a little bit in that light as well. And Katharina, maybe start with you. I'd like to ask you a little just about what consumers can expect. A lot of privacy has come to the fore because perhaps of the Facebook scandal as well. And what do you think from particularly the law that's coming into effect in May, what will change for consumers?
Yeah, from the consumer perspective, I think the most important change is that, until this point, we had several incidents in Europe where we had huge data breaches or privacy scandals, and the fines which followed then were like, and no, you cannot compare this to the possible gains you have maybe from breaching, making or using the data of your consumers in a way which is not legal. And for example, when Google is fined with 300,000 euro for using data in a non-proper way, this is this is like a bad joke for any consumer organization, but this was the case, for example, in Germany. The highest fine which was ever imposed on a company was 1 million euro for a very, very major privacy incident. And this will change. Under the new GDPR, this the maximum fine will be up to 4% of the worldwide turnover of a company. So for Facebook, this would be more than 1 billion euro. And I think this is from an economic perspective, as an economist, I would say there is a strong incentive to care about the privacy of your consumers now. And I think this is the most important change. And also this is a change for many organizations because, in fact, I know many people who work inside of larger companies as privacy officers, and I think they really care, even if their company doesn't care so much like they do. And of course, you often have bargaining situations or different interests inside of a company. For example, when the marketing person says, yeah, we want to do targeted audience stuff with Facebook and upload user data, and the privacy officer says, well, this is not that legal because in our terms of service, we say we will never give the data of our customer to a third party. And they said, yeah, well, but the fine is so low and we can gain so much from it. Then I think this situation will actually change. And in fact, I noticed myself that from a Facebook dump I got, you can do that for yourself. If you use Facebook, then you can get a small piece of the huge chunk of data you give to this company, and then you also see which company like shares your email address with Facebook. And there was this one larger hardware supplier from Germany who did that, and this was actually not legal at all. And I hopefully these incidents will get less frequent as they are right now. And the second major change, I think, which is a huge chance, is the right to data portability. Right now, it's very, very difficult to get your personal data at all from a company. Any information like what kind of data do you collect from me? For example, if I ask Amazon, please give me my personal data, they will first try to give me a very small piece of data, which just basically says what I ordered, and I already know that. But the interesting thing is the click stream, obviously, and they don't give that to customers right now so easily. And to get data portability means that you have the right to move from one company to another company without starting with a blank piece of paper. And this is very powerful for changing one reason why we have so many privacy issues in several areas, because I think often we try to fix things in the area of privacy which are rooted rather in the area of competition, that you have a lack of competition. And of course, data portability will not fix problems we have with Facebook, because where you have network effects, we should rather talk about open standards and interconnectivity and other issues. But for example, when you talk about Dropbox and competition or other areas, then this is a really, really powerful tool. And another interesting aspect of a GDPR from a consumer perspective are the newly introduced EU-wide privacy icons. Unfortunately, they are not mandatory to use. They are voluntarily. For example, this means that I go to when I visit the web page of a company and I think, wow, the terms of service, it would take me maybe 1.5 hours to read them, and I'm not a lawyer, so I even would not understand half of it. Then like easy standardized symbols could help me as a consumer to understand what this company will do with my data. For example, are there even like limits how long my data is stored, or is this data stored forever? But of course, I like the idea that some companies or some service providers, maybe even Mozilla or others, will use these icons. But I would even more like the idea that Facebook and others would be forced to use these icons too, so I can compare different services. And I think still, the GDPR has a lot of improvement on several fields, but still, from a consumer perspective, there are much more things to do. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a compromise. This is a political compromise. In the original things, different NGOs from all over Europe submitted, there were much more or much higher standards, and we should not lay back now and say we have a GDPR, this will save us now. This is not the fact. There's much more to do.
Well, I'd like to ask perhaps towards the end also about some of the extra things that we can do. But for now, maybe I can also turn to you, Dirk, and put some of those questions to you, or not questions, but specifically, Katharina mentioned fines and also data portability. And maybe I could just ask you what kind of challenges you feel there are for companies when it comes to implementing this. What are the biggest changes that companies are going to face in those two areas?
As usual, the answer is it depends. Now, first of all, I would start with one comment on GDPR globally. I think I agree with you that that's not the final thing, and such a law has to develop over time. But we made a huge step forward. When we see what we had in Germany, for example, it was a pretty high standard, but with low fines, I agree. But if you compare that across Europe, we had a landscape which was very different. And if we compare that globally, we come to a very different perspective. Now we will have a regulation which sets the same standard across all European Union countries. And even the UK said after leaving the EU, they will keep on doing that. But even more than that, it applies to each and every company in the world who deals with European data. So we just don't have a European law here now. We have something which really sets the stage globally. And coming back to the Facebook testimony, if you see that there are already discussions even in the US about raising standards. If it happens, I would be glad, but we will see. But I mean, we see there's something changing. Now, coming back to your question, what are the biggest challenges for companies? It really depends. So when you come to the larger organizations who are dealing with data a lot, they know about privacy. If they do it right or wrong, it's a different question, but they know how to fix that. I mean, I take ourselves, we started about 7-8 months ago, really to set up our own group on becoming 100% more or less. You never be 100% compliant, that's not working, but to set the stage. So we're nearly there. But when I'm going to customers, I see a lot of companies haven't even started to really think about it. So that's the challenge, number one. It's a long process. You have to have a clear look. The biggest challenge today is not about how can I protect data? What can I use? The first step is, where do I store my data? Where is this data? So we did a research with IDC a year ago and asked a lot of companies in Europe on, do you know where all the data of your customers and of your employees is stored? And the return was about half of the companies were able to find half of the data. So that's the number one challenge. And then you come to the point where you say, okay, what do I do with mobile? What happens with mobile phones? What kind of data is dealt there? Because we have a major shift from, I have everything protected in my own environment, and now data is floating around. So all these kind of things. Mobile is a huge topic on the risk. And of course, if I don't know where my data is, I can't do data portability or the right of be forgotten. That's the biggest challenge, and I think that's what a lot of companies are currently doing. But we should be clear: the smallest number of companies will be really compliant by May 25th. So it's a process, and I think from all the discussions I had with privacy officers across Europe, that's what they are looking for. They want to see that companies start really thinking about the protection of private data. And it's a very interesting discussion you have with these kind of companies, because you start, how do you deal with your own data? So with your plans, with your projects, with your ideas you have, with your products, how do you protect these data? And then you come very quickly, and can you apply that to personal data? It's not a big deal. These kind of protection products are there. So it's a process, and it started, I mean, you said it's 2 years ago that it was implemented, and now it comes to force, but as usual, we are now in the stage a month ahead that it's really getting the hot topic.
Well, Andreas, maybe I can turn that to you. What do you think, particularly on the technical side, in other words, needs to be done by May 25th, but also, as Dick mentioned, over the next year or so? It's fascinating to hear that, say, many companies were not only aware of always necessarily what they need to do to comply, but don't even necessarily know where their data is stored. How does that work on the technical side? What can they implement? How can they find their data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it really depends strongly on the company size. I think for startups, it will be often very easy to implement the GDPR because they have like very few data processing systems, and they don't have data in few places normally. For the larger companies, where, as you say, they often don't even know where the data is stored or what data they even have, it will be like hopefully a big shift in the engineering culture, and I think that's also a good thing. So I'm overall very positive about the GDPR, because if those incentives, like these scary numbers really work, then it will really shift the engineering practices that were commonplace before that. For example, personally, you probably know this website haveibeenpawned.net, where you can see if your credentials, like your email address or password, got stolen in the past. And for example, my email address and my password were stolen 7 times in the last 10 years, I think. So, and that just shows that there's a lot of bad practices, even at large companies, going on. And if they're really these fines, then probably this will shift. And I mean, if I would pick one area where I would start as a company, it would be the directory of processing activities. So that's basically a list where you have all the activities where you process person-related data and where you have to write down what you do with that, where you store it, for which purpose, etc. So I think most of the companies, they will start by writing that or updating that if they already have something like that. And then from there, you can actually see where are you compliant, where might you need to change the way you store data, in which countries, for example, in which formats, how you make the data accessible, who can see the data in your companies, how you encrypt that. So, but there are really 100 different things that you have to do there. But I think the first step is really get an overview of the data that you have, and then you can see which areas are the most important and the most crucial. Yeah. So as you say, 100% compliance is not realistic, at least for the larger companies, but you can get as far as you can in the small amount of time you have. So. And then keep working on that, of course, yeah.
Have you been surprised on that, about how many companies aren't aware of the data that they have? Does that surprise you?
For larger companies, honestly, no, it's not so surprising because, I mean, even physical servers or computers often are not locatable within an organization like a German DAX company, for example. So I can kind of understand it, but I think it's good if that changes because we have seen with the Facebook scanner and these other things that personal data can actually harm people if it gets into the wrong hands. So companies should really be have more focus on these things, and it's absolutely doable. It's just that you have to invest some money and some effort to do it. And hopefully with the GDPR, the companies finally have a good reason to do that.
Once a friend told me that's getting ready for the GDPR and mapping all the data processing services in a company reminds him of doing your tax declaration for the first time. He says, in advance, 2 years in advance, I need to do this, and there is this deadline. And I have all the things are there. I just need to sort it out somehow. And in the end, you notice oh my God, I could change this process and maybe I could benefit from that. And I'm really convinced that regardless of how large or small the company is, you can still learn a lot from that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, maybe put that to you, Dirk. Particularly, it's interesting that it's bigger companies in a way that have the bigger challenge. One might think that big companies could advise a smaller company on how to go about this implementation. I mean, how do you say that? What are the challenges, even say for BlackBerry?
There's a good reason why. I mean, you described it very, very good. There's a good reason why larger enterprises have bigger issues in locating all the data, because the bigger you are, the more data you process, the more tools you use to process data, the more complex your systems are. And if you didn't do your homework and really mapped it from the beginning, and you haven't been forced to do so, you might run into a situation where things get rough. But I agree, that's a good process to start with. And on the other hand, we have a tendency at the moment to export processes to the cloud, for example, cloud services for HR purposes or for customer relation purposes and so on. And so you have a third-party process or storing your data from your employees or from anybody else. And the same thing is, we do all mobile, and the more employees you have dealing with mobile, the bigger the risk is. So, I mean, there are stats about how many phones are lost just in taxis in Berlin. So it's a huge amount. I think it was something around 500 devices per month or something. It's really huge. So. And just imagine what it is. And so there's a very interesting document from the European Privacy Commissioner, who said for him, so just I can't say it in the correct words, but for him it's something like if you lose a phone without a good protection on it and a management protection on the phone, for him it's a data breach. So these kind of things. And then you come to a point where you start to have in the IT service backup systems. So what do you do with your backup systems? You can't really delete data on backup systems. So you have to do all these, you have to sit down and think about it. So it's, of course, it's easier for a smaller company because you don't have so many points where you have to start with. But it's a good practice. And once you start it, and that's I fully agree. Once you started that, you see it doesn't always make sense to store the data. You save space, so you can really save money with the minimization of data you process. You don't want to have these data in future because you don't want to have customers just coming around and saying, okay, I want you to delete my data. So you want to minimize these efforts. So it's a good start to minimize data, and I think that's the key to everything for us. We as larger enterprises need to think about how can we minimize the data we have and still can run our systems perfectly, and that's a different approach, and it's another point in the GDPR. It's a privacy by design. I mean, BlackBerry is a company. We once built phones, secure phones. We don't do that anymore. We had a hard time, but we're on track now. No, but the point is, we are coming from a privacy perspective. We always had a privacy-first approach in our businesses. So when you start designing privacy into your products from the early beginning, and we're not just talking about hardware or software things, it's about thinking about processes you want to have and think privacy in the first step. And just one amendment still to the privacy officers. That's one of my best discoveries over the last couple of months. These guys were usually the bad guys in the company. You know, they came in and the fun stopped. So everybody wanted to do something cool and big, and let's do something. And the privacy officer came in, and so things, yeah. All of a sudden, they are seen in the company. They understand that it's a not just a necessary tool, but that these people can really bring something good to the company. It's not just about stopping the fun, but maybe even improving the processes, even saving money, even seeing new opportunities. So I see GDPR as an opportunity for companies, not as a risk.
Well, it's interesting that, as you say, there's been an increased awareness in that sense. Also, the people within companies that are involved in privacy issues. Katharina, maybe I could turn to you on pivoting to what do you think is the role? What would you like the role of governments to be at this point when it comes to monitoring this? To make sure that companies are enforcing the new rules. What would you like to? What do you think the role is for them at this point to make sure that, as Dirk said, they are listening to their privacy person?
Yeah, first of all, as a privacy activist, of course, I would hope that governments would stop using loopholes in the GDPR to lower down like existing privacy levels in very specific areas where this is possible. For example, this was the case in Germany concerning like overview over Secret Service data from like the privacy authorities, or for example in the healthcare sector or in other sectors. And second, of course, I would expect governments to provide more money for the privacy authorities to do their job. Basically, first of all, you need more manpower, not only to look for people you can sue or fine, but also for maybe do a bit of consulting for small and medium companies who can't afford to hire like the best lawyers possible to explain to them how to do their processes. And I think this is also like the understanding of the role that many privacy authorities in Europe already have. They not only like are the bad guys to stop the fun, but actually they are also the people you can ask when you need to have like insights how you can structure your processes well. And of course, first of all, I think we need more money, more manpower for these authorities. But of course, we also need more money, more funding for consumer organizations who empower people to sue companies based on the new law. Because I think it's not realistic to think that my neighbor will next morning wake up and say, yeah, we have GDPR now. Now I sue Facebook because I just have a lawyer. He's a friend of mine, and he's not the best lawyer, but I can afford him, and he will sue Facebook to the ground. And I think my neighbor knows this is not realistic. Also, his lawyer does know this, and I think it's maybe better to empower consumer organizations so that they can find interesting cases, advise people how to strategically build up their case and make their case, and so that in the end they can maybe win something not just for themselves but for a lot of other consumers. And there are actually many different NGOs who already said they want to go this way. For example, Max Schrems founded his new NGO, which is called None of Your Business. And I think that's a very, very nice title for an NGO, which wants to sue companies based on a new law. And also the German Federal Consumer Organization has a project where they call for people to submit interesting cases, so they can look for cases where they say, yeah, we want to focus our manpower also on our expertise in this field to make this case big and to win this case. And that's what I expect from governments, not only to say, yeah, the GDPR is here, you should all be happy, but also to enforce it or help it to be enforced by the people.
Can I just ask on that too? You mentioned that you've also campaigned for governments to in a sense, against governments taking data themselves from companies. Do you expect anything on that front to change from your front? Is there any onus on governments as a result of this to change practices?
Unfortunately not, because this is another policy field. You have it's more easier to do European legislation on the economic field, on the common market, than, for example, when it comes to Secret Service. This is the national field where every nation can set their own rules. And I also, unfortunately, even after Snowden, I don't see a high willingness to comply to any international agreement on privacy standard. And actually, what I saw in not only in Germany but also in other European countries is that unfortunately most governments didn't learn from Snowden. On the contrary, I organized several protests against a new law for the German Secret Service, BND, which has now more rights to. They even legalized the stuff they did before, and I think this is totally not acceptable from a civil rights point of view. They are now allowed to do surveillance on foreign journalists, and that's why Amnesty and other organizations did protest against it. But unfortunately, we didn't win. So there was a large group of NGOs which decided to sue the government, and I wish them a lot of luck. And I'm personally suing the government on 2 other interesting cases because of data retention and another law. And so I think this is still the field where we need to put a lot of pressure and power on the governments, because in fact I don't think that in our times you really can separate between private and government data, because in the moment when governments decide to introduce law that allow them to access this data from companies, even when the companies don't want to give this data, they are obliged to do that. And there is this gag order, for example, in the US. There are other similar laws in different European states. And of course, you can decide that you want to have a higher standard for your customers, and you say you encrypt the personal data in such a form that you cannot give this data to governments. And unfortunately, this is what I would recommend companies to do right now, because I don't see policy change coming, but of course we will still fight for this change.
Yeah, so personally, if I can comment on that, I'm a bit less excited, of course, about people suing companies. I think it's also an important aspect, of course, that as a citizen or a user, you have the right to do that. But I'm also a bit worried that it might skew like the chance of success more towards like these large players. Because if you look at companies like Google or Facebook, if you go to their privacy page, you will see that they're probably 100% prepared for GDPR. So all the functions are already there, like all the data export, import, etc. is working. So they will probably have no problem like replying to all of these requests. But for a small company like a startup, getting sued by like a customer or like having to like answer all these requests can of course be a big burden. So I really hope that the European Union and the company and the countries, they find like a good compromise to like really get the intent of the law, so to say, into the practice and not something else. I mean, like the cookie compliance law, like the e-privacy would, for me, like be a slightly negative example, because now, as you probably all know, we have on each side like a little banner that says, okay, we have cookies on this side, and then everyone clicks on that banner, and then there's still cookies on the side. So it really doesn't help the user, because the cookies are still there and they're not getting blocked, and the companies, they all have to comply with that and all have to face like the risk of getting sued. So I really hope with the GDPR, and I'm pretty optimistic about that, that we will find something that actually really moves the needle in towards privacy, while not like overburdening the companies with these things.
Yeah, but still, I think that like enforcing law is never a bad thing. But because when you don't decide to enforce it, then why do you need the law in the first place? And I actually think that it will be even more the case that competitors would start suing other companies, because they say like this is this is not fair play what the other company is doing. I'm complying to the law. I'm not like collecting sensitive data for targeted advertisement, for example, or for other reasons, but my competitor is doing that. And I even think that this will be more often the case when consumer organizations doing it, because still, unfortunately, there is not enough manpower in the civil society to sue like small startups. I mean, it depends on what kind of startup. I mean, for example, when there is a startup which has a business model which is based on collective, very sensitive, for example, healthcare data, and like store and sell it in a not legal way, then I would not be against suing it. Why not? I mean, it's not against the law. So I think this argument, like small startup, yeah, okay, there are small companies, there are big companies, but in the end, it's about the law.
Dirk, maybe I could get your view on some of this as well. What do you? We spoke earlier about fines, but this is the other point. What do you see as the risks from lawsuits? How do you view
that? Of course, I'm not a big fan of lawsuits. Now, honestly, I fully agree. If we see things happening which are definitely not correct, we should have things in place to get that right, and the lawsuit is definitely one option. But what I see, and that's for me very positive. Just that the law is there. We see, let's say, 2/3 of the companies really changing their mind because they are afraid of fines, and that's a natural fact. And sometimes it only helps to impose these kind of fines to make people aware of what's happening. But I would like to have a situation where we really support companies thinking about privacy, getting privacy right, instead of just going there and trying to sue. I see a bigger risk. I don't see the risk in the civil society. And I don't see a risk in companies suing companies, because that's a normal thing. And I really appreciate civil society to look for these really bad cases. My bigger risk is that I see smaller law firms coming up and making a business model out of it. I mean, we all know these kind of law firms who try to go after these people who just downloaded some illegal music and stuff like that. And I'm really a bit afraid that that's a business model for them for the future, to go after companies and say, hey, I think you have a privacy issue. I don't think you can delete all the data if somebody asks. So let's try it. I find somebody and let's try it. And the request will be, okay, we can do two things. We can go to court and have a official decision, or you pay us a amount of money. So that's my risk. I'm not afraid about situations where people come and go after their right. I'm afraid about others using that tool to harm the process. And when that starts, privacy is not a good thing anymore for companies, which is at the moment. At the moment, people start seeing privacy as a positive thing. And if that happens, it's again this risk factor, and the DPO again will be the bad guy, and we get back to the recent years, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. So my recommendation to all companies I'm dealing with is always, if you're not sure about what you're doing, go to your privacy officer in your country. Ask them. I mean, they might not be able to answer because they have not the manpower, but the more they do, the more it's recognized that they need more money and they need more power. So I think that's the right approach.
Yeah, but I would agree that implementation would be a challenge for some companies, but still I think it's realistic to achieve a goal of at least compliance 90% in the next 2 years. And I also see big chances for free software in this field. For example, when you have these cases that people request their data and you need a process that companies like make a data dump and give this data dump to the people, then why not like funding, for example, projects that program solutions for small and medium businesses for answering requests based on free software. So this is, I think, there is a solution for this problem. And I think the main problem is not like that we are enforcing privacy right now. The main problem is that we didn't do that for the last years. And of course, there is a change right now, and this will be a struggle for some companies, not for all, but I wouldn't. I still think that this is a large benefit or a correction from the last, for the development of the last 10 years.
Andreas, perhaps perhaps you want to follow up on that, but also one question is just, we mentioned, or Dirk mentioned, perhaps there won't be, or doesn't believe there will be lawsuits necessarily between companies. What do you think about the challenge of third parties, so companies that work with somebody else, perhaps, or either their own clients or others that are involved in the data protection, who has the responsibility there for it, and do you see problems on that front?
Mm-hmm. So I just want to say, concerning the data portability, that's an interesting point, because we also have a proposal for an open source software for exactly this. So I think it will be a big chance not only for open source software, but also for other use cases of that data, because it will be more like before it was more that companies kind of owned the user data. I mean, you could get it out, but it was very cumbersome, and they would send you a pile of paper and you couldn't do anything with that. But now you can actually get your data. So it's more like you lend it to the company, but you can have it back and you can do interesting stuff with that. So I think that will be a great thing, yeah. And concerning, the sub-processors, so if you have other companies that process the data for you, you also under GDPR have to check that they comply with all the guidelines, and they have to be very strict themselves about confidentiality and all the sub-processors they use. In that area, I think also the standard will really improve, and it will hopefully make some practices less viable. For example, now if you go to a website, you often have 40, 50 or 60 different tracking cookies. So that means 60 third parties have your data, and those third parties probably also have, again, 10 parties that maybe store the data or process it for them. So you have a few hundred different companies that hold your data, and managing this under GDPR, well, you can try, but I think it's not viable. So I think, I hope that companies will really see that having too many sub-processes is also not a good idea, and you have to focus on either keeping the data in your own infrastructure or work with processes that can process that in a reasonable amount, in a reasonable way, so to say. So, but again, we will see. I hope so.
Dirk, do you have any thoughts on that, about whether these sort of sub-processors will be reduced as a result?
We are usually a sub-processor, first of all. So hopefully we are not reduced now. Well, I think there will be a shift from I take everything possible. I do whatever is out there, and I use all the cookie stuff, and I have a processor here and a processor there. It's exactly the point. I have to take so much care because, I mean, part of GDPR is the accountability principle. So there's only one who's really responsible for the data, and that's the company who owns the data in first hand. So there's no way to say, okay, it wasn't me, it was them. So that would change things. But on the other hand, it's a huge opportunity for sub-processors who take care of privacy, who have their things together, you know, who had a look on their processes, who do privacy by design. I mean, when I started for BlackBerry 8 years ago, and we talked about that was the time where we tried to sell phones still, even to consumers, and we tried to sell phones to consumers based on privacy, talking about privacy, and nobody cared. I mean, we did a lot of mistakes, but privacy was not a reason to choose something, and it's still not. Not that much, but it got better. But it's still not the reason. On a company side, I currently see processes where privacy becomes a vital term. I mean, if we see tenders from companies now for mobile security solutions we offer, for example, all of a sudden privacy is a part of it. They are asking about GDPR compliance. They are asking about where's the data processed. Do you have agreements in place that you can transfer data, for example, to the US? Are you part of Privacy Shield, which I'm not a big fan of? I mean, we're a Canadian company. We have the advantage that the Canadian privacy law is better, and it's recognized by the EU. But we see a change of the selection of sub-processors, and that's my hope. That's what I meant with, I want to have a climate where privacy is something good and not seen as a risk.
Well, before we go to questions shortly, but Katharina, let me ask you more broadly on that then. Do you think has the balance been tipped in your mind? Do you think people do care, as Dirk said, more about privacy now and will actually make a decision which company to use based on that, perhaps more than 5 years ago, 2 years ago?
I would say so, because I mean, I'm working on the issue of privacy since I guess 10 years now, or more than 10 years. And my feeling was that 10 years ago, when we had debates about privacy, it was more abstract, like someone could do something with your data. And now it's like, oh my God, my healthcare insurance was hacked, and now my private data is sold on the dark market, and will I ever get the healthcare insurance again? And this is like not like an abstract case, but this is like things actually happening to people. And also like the issue about transparency when it comes to filters was a very abstract debate. And now we have this Cambridge Analytica case and the debates about the Trump election and Brexit. So it's more like this is actually things that affect me. Or these are things that affect me, my life, my family, and my well-being, or maybe the well-being of my children. And yeah, a child that is born today has like a data shadow already like being in place before it is born. So I really think that the attitude changed, but still you have these debates saying like, yeah, people criticize Facebook, but they don't quit, so they don't disagree with the policy. And there I would disagree as an economist, because if you would have like the if you would be able to choose between two like identical products, like for example 2 different mobile phone system with like the same amount of apps and all these what is connected to the ecosystem, then you would really have a choice. Yeah, but right now you don't have a choice. We are talking not about like services. We are talking about ecosystems now. We are talking about ecosystems that have a monopoly over what their users see in their app store and what they not see, what fines are taken, or like what what like amount or proportion of the turnover is you need to get to give, for example, to Apple or to Google when you sell something in your app store. And from my point of view, these are monopolistic structures. For example, when I chose to switch from Microsoft or from Windows to Linux, the first time was hard. I had to implement a lot of things by myself on my computer so that it would work at least, because you could not get pre-installed like Ubuntu computer who was like which I wanted to buy. And this is like the situation you have like with many things. For example, when you want to buy a device, you have the choice either to have this operating system or that operating system. And they are like walled gardens, like Tim Berners-Lee once described this structure. And I really think we need to talk now. We have the GDPR, and well, of course, this is super nice, but still, the main issue we have in privacy is also about competition and about standardization and about open or closed structures. And this is like the root for a lot of problems we have. So I really am convinced, or I see it also with my friends and my family. They care a lot about privacy, but they don't see that they have really a choice. Because when you say, for example, I want to use a different app store, which is like more open and not controlled by Google, then I need to spend some hours to learn things. And a lot of people say, like, I'm not convinced that I'm capable of that. And this is like the situation we have, and that's why I think we need to talk not only about privacy but also about competition in this market.
Well, Andreas, let me ask you a similar question, but maybe for companies, what do you think has something really changed? Have we reached a tipping point where perhaps companies also are more concerned, or perhaps don't see the potential of big data, for example, as much as they used to? Could this shift their thinking?
Yeah, I think, two things. I think still privacy is definitely valued by users, but I think very few users would be ready to pay for that, actually. So I think with GDPR and the new legislation, the shift goes more into the direction, okay, if I give you my data, I expect that you implement these super security measures, but I won't pay you more money for that, So on one hand, yeah, it's a shift, but still, like, convincing people to pay more for privacy is still a challenge, at least in my experience. And so what was the second question again? Sorry.
Just curious, when companies used to speak about, or when everyone sees the potential for big data, and I'm just wondering there, do you think that that's been being reviewed right now because of the privacy concerns?
Yeah, big data has been a bit overhyped in the last years. So in general, I think companies are being more realistic now, what you can and cannot do with that. And they also think a bit more about the privacy impact, because like with scandals like the Facebook case here or other cases where user data was like used in ways that were like not like transparent to the user himself or herself, I think their companies really need to be more careful and like let the user know exactly what they're doing with the data, and GDPR helps with that, of course. But I still think there's a huge potential, and we will see probably like many apps and new solutions that are AI based, or that at least use AI in some of the aspects. I think if it comes to personal data, the companies just have to be more open about what they're doing, and say, okay, I'm using this data to serve you better ads, and I'm using this kind of algorithm, and I do this and that to make sure that I don't discriminate against people. I think this will be more important, because most of the wrongdoings that we have with algorithms, they are not there, in my opinion at least, because companies are evil and they want to do harm to the companies, but because like it's really easy to miss some things, and like to unwillingly discriminate against people using an algorithm. And I think there we really have a lot of like things that companies need to do better, to make sure that there is no discrimination and no other things that shouldn't be in the algorithm. Yeah, but it's possible. Yeah.
Well, I can keep going, but I think it would be time for some questions. We can talk, I think, a long time about this. But yeah, I'd like to open it up a little bit. Go ahead, anyone who has questions.
We talked a lot about
Yeah.
Hi there. Yeah, we talked a lot about companies and what it means to companies, but the same rules apply to nonprofits too, and even to personal, private people. So, for example, now people don't want to stay on Facebook. They choose to install a Mastodon instance to offer to their friends and maybe family, and they are publicly seeing the server on the net for somebody. And then is it possible that a commercial competition like Facebook, whatever, says, oh, we don't like that, and we sue them, and we take, and because there's something they did wrong and they can prove it, and something like that? How much is the risk for nonprofits to run open source software, decentralized software with this legal setup?
So if I may say something, when it comes to persons, like an individual doing data processing of other people, there's actually an exception in GDPR. If you do that for familiar or personal reasons, so for example, if you have like a family photo album or a Mastodon instance for you and your friends, then you're under most cases exempt from the GDPR, or for most things at least. So there I see little risk something happening to you. About nonprofits, of course, to my knowledge, they get treated just exactly like all other companies, so they have to like follow the same guidelines.
Yeah, and I would also say it's from my point of view, it's very important that also NGOs comply to the GDPR, because this is actually very sensible data. For example, when I'm a political NGO and I store, like, for example, when I'm a petition platform and I store data about who of my supporters signed for which petition, and not everyone choose to like disclose that publicly, then of course they should comply as well. No, but for I mean, it should be clear that the fines should be different for a company like Facebook and an NGO or a non-profit. But I think this will be the case in the first lawsuits that will be there in the next years.
I mean, especially political data about political views is like especially protected, just like medical data. So you have to be extra careful, so to say, when processing that.
I think it's kind of related, but I'm wondering about me as a person who is an employee of a company. And I think GDPR protects companies to private individuals, and employees are treated differently. And I wondered if there's any consideration of that.
I mean, if you're an employee of the company, you leave personal data with the company. So it's part of the personal data which has to be protected, of course. I mean, it's the same level.
And Germany, in general, there's an interesting case there as well, because the GDPR has an opening clause regarding like employee data protection. So the countries they don't have to, but they can make regulations that differ from the GDPR in that areas. And I think Germany wants to, unfortunately, make use of that. And we don't know if it's good or bad. It makes stuff more complicated, which we obviously like here. So we will see. But there can be exceptions, and it's not like the same as for other areas where GDPR applies. Yeah.
How strong of a European connection does an individual have to be in practice covered by GDPR? If you're using a European VPN, or if you have an Estonian e-residency, or are you working on a contract for a European organization, what kind of connection do you really need to have?
So to my knowledge, it doesn't matter where you are as a user. What matters is actually two things. First, if the company that does the data processing is a European company, or if that company, even if it's not a European company, sells services or tries to sell things to people in Europe. So if it's a company like Facebook that explicitly says, okay, if you're in Germany, you can sign up for Facebook. We want people here. We are a US company, but you can do that. You can sign up. Then they would have to comply to GDPR. If it's a company that only says, okay, we're doing only business with US customers, and we're making sure by technical or other means that no, for example, European customer can sign up for our service, then to my knowledge, they could be exempt from GDPR. But it really, I think it depends on how they actually try to enter that market, or if they explicitly try to have customers in the European Union.
I always recommend companies who are asking that kind of question to make it as simple as possible. As soon as you deal with European citizens, comply. It's the easiest thing. I mean, of course, there's exceptions and options. I mean, as soon as you have data from a European citizen, there we go. It's the easiest thing to describe it, I think.
Yeah, I have to say this is one of the great things about the GDPR, because it kind of like sucks in companies into the system. You know, they have to comply even if they don't want to, even if they're outside of Europe. So we'll see how much these rules can be enforced. That's the other question, of course, if a company is somewhere where it's hard to like get to them legally. But I think in general, it's a very good thing. Yeah.
Can I go ahead? Hi, everyone. Thanks for the very interesting presentation before. So the question that I have is just about enforcement, and I'm really glad to hear that the GDPR internally within organizations has spurred into action and a desire to comply with the regulation. However, for any regulation to have teeth, there has to be enforcement behind it. And I'm wondering, how prepared do you think the data protection authorities actually are to enforce the law? And I ask that because there was something that I read last month in the Financial Times that the Information Commissioner's Office, so the British Data Protection Authority, has a turnover rate of 40%. Yep. And their commissioner was saying that her impression is that she's using her scarce resources at the moment to train data protection authorities for dominant social media platform. And I suppose that is quite concerning, that as a consumer or as a data subject, come May, if there is an organization that I think is mishandling my data, what recourse do I have? And I also wear this sort of wearing a few different hats here, that I am affiliated with an organization that is not making any efforts to comply with the GDPR and does not feel particularly threatened, because they feel like on the spectrum of organizations that are going to be an immediate target, the chances are they have an extra few years before there's going to be, any possibility, of enforcement happening against them. And of course, enforcement comes in many ways. Fines are not necessarily the first and not the only tool in a regulator's toolkit. But you mentioned before capacity building and things like this. But that can only happen if the data protection authorities have resources. So how can we get the data protection authorities ready? Thanks.
Yeah, I found it, I would share this idea that actually they try to be prepared, but they are not prepared at all. I mean, if you have like an average like Imbiss in Berlin, for example, a Döner, the chances are higher that you get inspected by like the hygiene health authorities than if you have like a startup, for example, that's to have any contact at all with a privacy authority. And I really like the idea of some European countries who had like a interesting system that the fines they get from companies when they sue someone, a company, that they get these fines for their own budget. So you have a very large incentive also to look for like big targets, and usually big targets are also targets who have a lot of consumers or customers. So I think there is a lot of improvement. I mean, in Germany, you have a very high standard compared to other countries. One time I spoke with someone from the privacy like the privacy authority of Poland, and he was like, wow, you are complaining on a very, very high level there in Germany. So still, of course, governments need to give more money, more manpower. And also I worked once for like a privacy authority in Germany and Schleswig-Holstein, which is smaller.
With an exception, they're really good. Yeah,
it's they're really good, and they are also very proactive. But still, you see these piles of like people who submit like cases, and you will never be able to work through this, and this needs to change.
But just to add on that, I mean, I fully agree. We have to find ways where we can give the privacy commissioners' offices enough manpower. We have a couple of challenges to that. I mean, first of all, it's not a very well-paid job usually. So in countries where you have a large competition for talent, war for talent, it's really hard to get them. I mean, I know a couple of them who have a lot of open racks, but just don't find the right people. That's one thing. I mean, we have also to invest into into education and into education of privacy experts, because they're just too few. And you know, just think about the regulation says you have to have a DPO, so a data privacy officer in future. So these are experts. These should be experts. So they're gone from the market, because usually a company can pay a bit more than a public authority. So we have to give them money, first of all. We have to invest in education for them, and we have to give them power. And that's for me the important thing. They have to be able to really do things, and it's a tricky thing. They have a lot of piles, I know, and they would love to do so. But I know the UK Privacy Commissioner pretty good, and she's very clear on that she doesn't have enough resources, but she wants to use the resources to really focus on discovering things which are really a problem, and not just trying to solve every single issue. It's about helping the environment to understand privacy is an issue, and there is a risk to be seen. I mean, it's always hard to get everyone, but there is a risk that will be the case. And on the other hand, let people know, let companies know that there are ways to comply, that it's not a bad thing, and it's you know, it's always these two sides. But give them money, yeah, I agree. Let's go to the Bundestag, to the budget committee, give them money.
Okay, I have a question here that came in via Slack, which is, what is, in your opinion, the specific role and readiness of browsers?
Well,
I'm just passing it on.
Yeah, I mean, from a consumer perspective, of course, I appreciate privacy-friendly browsers, because for many people, this is basically their gateway to the rest of the world or the internet. So I think it's very, very basic that we have that people can choose between, or they have the choice to use privacy-friendly browsers. But at the same time, I also think that browsers who do not comply so much with the ideal of maximum privacy for the users, but rather with let's track them, they should also be forced to at least agree on a minimum standard. And I personally use Firefox since many, many years, and hopefully I will use it for a longer time. And I don't appreciate that some web pages, when I turn on the maximum privacy standards and Firefox, that they display me please disable do not track. I think this is not the message I want to hear when I want to decide to go back to this website any soon. So I would really appreciate when we also get to this point where we have a gold standard for privacy in web browsers, because this is a very basic thing for people obvious. I mean, that is their gateway to the world.
So yeah, I fully agree with all of that. One thing that I might add from my personal experience, in 2017 I was working with a journalist, and we were also trying to find out how data brokers collected data about users, and we found one data broker that was collecting a lot of data, and also without most of the users knowing. And the way they did it was through a browser, because they had extensions there, so little helpers, sometimes even for privacy related things, that would collect the data from the user. And that's kind of illustrates nicely how that the browser is at the same time a good tool for privacy, but also of course very interesting for data collectors, because the user spends his or her whole day in front of the browser sometimes, and all the data goes through there. So if you can put yourself in that in the browser and then get the data that the user is seeing, that's tremendously dangerous. And I think in this area, at least most of the browsers, they don't have good enough controls. In the Chrome store, for example, I don't know about Firefox, but probably there as well, you can still find a lot of extensions that I would say are very risky for the privacy of the user, because they collect user data, and often they do it without the user actually knowing. So I think if I would name one area where browsers can improve, then it's definitely in this whole third-party ecosystem. So.
But that applies to
that applies to many technologies, of course, yeah. So,
wherever, I mean,
wherever the data is, people will try to get it, yeah.
But just to finalize that, I mean, the problem I see is that it's really hard to compare for a normal person. I mean, how do I understand what kind of browser has a better privacy than the other? I mean, you have the choice, and I mean, you're doing a good marketing, and people know that, but it's really hard. I mean, it's really hard to, do I trust you? I mean, privacy is a thing of trust at the end of the day. So it's really, we need to take care that it's clear who does what, and that people know. So that I think that's the biggest challenge we have, to bring it out there and educate people that privacy is a complex thing, and you just have to feel well with doing that. And I think that's a big important thing.
Yes, hi. The GDPR is quite complex, and I'm sure most people don't fully understand it. So how can I, as a consumer, find out if all the services I use comply to the regulations? Or what can I do exactly to find out?
Yeah, I would actually say it's a bit tricky as a non-lawyer and maybe a person who has an actual job or hobbies or friends or something to find out if any company you are in contact with complies with GDPR. To be honest, yeah, I would really, yeah, in this case, you really need to trust maybe also authorities or like NGOs you trust. There are a lot of interesting projects, for example, that are connected to the idea that, for example, the terms of service, yeah, we never read. What's in there? I mean, honestly, right now, most of the people don't have ever read any terms of service of a major service they use, and I spent one day where I tried to do it, and I ended up that I noticed it is impossible to order a pizza online without reading for 3 hours terms of service, because they had more than 10 trackers where you need to read the terms of service of these trackers. So yeah, I mean, I guess I know there will be some information projects by different NGOs, organizations, consumer organizations in various languages in the next years, which try to explain like on a low level the basics. Yeah, and I think that's honestly, as a consumer, that's all you need to know. And if you see something that doesn't seem to be complying like with a major service, then you can submit that to consumer organizations or authorities. But I don't think we need to study law, all of us right now, and we can keep our friends and our workplace.
But that's coming back to the browser thing we just discussed. I mean, it's nearly impossible. I mean, I wouldn't even say that I get every piece of the legislation. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm one of the few non-lawyers in our legal organization. But what I think is, we in Germany have a good tradition of doing things based on trust. So get back and start doing things where you think you can trust the company. If you find out you can't, change things.
Yeah, but still you can also run a test. For example, you can take like companies you are in contact or you share like very, very intimate data with, and then, for example, you can like say, I want to get the data dump, like my rights to data portability, or my rights that I need to know what you store about me, and then you just wait. How long does it take to get an answer? What's in this answer? And if it takes 5 months to give you an answer, then you can complain about this, and then this is also your right to complain about this, and you can be sure you are not a single one. And that's something everyone can do. And I actually think it's pretty interesting to have like a data dump from a service where you actually always ask yourself, like, what do they store about me? How does my clickstream look like? And this is really data I would like to have. So I would really encourage everyone just to try it out. I think you can do a lot of interesting stuff with your own data.
We actually have a question on Slack that is related to that or connects to that, which is, as a customer, when you request a data dump, how do you really know that all the data is delivered, and how can it be enforced to get like all the data?
Well, in principle, you have to trust the company to a certain degree. I mean, you can, of course, like devise like test schemes, you know, like clicking on stuff and then seeing if it actually shows up in your data there. So there are some possibilities, but in the end, it's like you don't get the access credentials to their databases, you know, as a customer or a user. So you have to like find out together. And I think like things like, yeah, organizing and like maybe planning to extract the data and then do something with that and see if it's really all there, that can help, but there's no perfect solution.
Yeah, but I actually always like prepare like a test case when I get my data. It's like a hobby of mine. So I always try, for example, I write a message or whatever, and then I delete it. So I know that this is like the deleted message, or this is the deleted data, and is it still afterwards in the data dump? Or for example, I click on things, as you said, or for example, I order things and cancel then the order, and you. For example, before you do the request, you can ask yourself, like, what is the contact I have with this company? For example, when I look on things and I get 2 days later an advertisement email which says, yeah, don't you want to come back and buy this thing you maybe already bought, then you can say, okay, they have actually data about this. And when you like write down your expectations, or also maybe your like traps or test cases, then you can compare it afterwards. So I would really encourage also to think about what do you want to need to know, or what do you expect to get or not to get, and then just take half an hour to do some testing with it, and then do the request.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, of course.
Yeah. But I mean, even before GDPR, there were lots of companies that just didn't delete the data and just instead flipped the switch and said, added a row like saying, okay, this data entry is deleted, and then you don't see it in your data dump, but it's still there, of course, on the server. So in the sense, 100% security or knowledge is not possible in there.
I was actually wondering about data portability as an individual and as a service provider. On the one hand, as an individual, I'm a bit worried that somebody might impersonate me and now can go to a company and get my data in a very handy format, easy to exploit. And as a service provider, firstly, how can I assure that this person is really the person? And especially if I'm privacy friendly, I might not have enough data to actually authenticate the person. So what do we do?
That's a very interesting question. I don't want to make advertising, but we are working on kind of solutions for that. I think there's no perfect solution. You have to rely on like different ways to authenticate your users. Companies, I mean, the GDPR itself doesn't say anything. They have like a guideline on data portability, which mentions that the user should be securely authenticated, but they don't tell you how to do it. So I think companies will be like implementing this very differently depending on how much expertise and how much like seriousness they have in that. So typically I expect that if you have a login area, so to say, where you already authenticated by another means, then you would be able to download your data from there. But of course, as you say, it's extremely dangerous because for such a data portability request, the company needs to centralize all of your data, and giving that to the wrong person can be a really big risk to you and to the company because they might get fined. So I honestly don't know what will be the solution, but probably we need like better authentication than we have now. So email and password, I think, is not enough in most cases.
I just want to jump in with one thing. Sometimes I get the feeling that we expect every company to be bad and don't want to do that right. We will always have cases where you find exactly that they don't do it right, and they don't really care about authentication and so on. But and that's really, I just want to enforce that. That's my experience over the last year. Companies want to do it right. And or the majority of the companies want to do it right. They sometimes don't know. And the smaller a company is, the more problematic it is. I mean, I can't talk about real examples, but in Germany we have a structure of a lot of medium and small companies with a lot of processes. And I recently met with a company who are one of the global leaders in a very weird area. They make a lot of money. They have about 900 employees, something. And these guys just said we never had to really care, and we never had a feeling for that, and we just don't know how to do it. We need help. And that's the other side. They want to do that, and not everybody is really good in it, and it is a complex thing. But we should not always expect companies just to try to harm us. There are also some of them that will be a surprise for all of you. There are some who are really good guys.
Yeah, I have a question based on your everyday dealings in your professional life with data privacy. Is it the GDPR something that you've wished for before? Like, do you find things that you wished had been implemented way before? And do you think this is a good legislation in order to tackle some of the problems we have? Or would you rather wish for some of a more constitutional document like Tim Berners-Lee said, the Magna Carta of the Internet?
I wish that that the process to get to a final GDPR legislation would have been shorter. I mean, I think we started really the discussion on GDPR about 8-9 years ago, and the first ideas in Brussels were totally different of what we see now. And of course, it would have been great to have that implemented 3-4 years ago. Some things might not have happened as they happened now, also due to the fines. But on the other hand, what we achieved here, and I can repeat that from earlier, is not that we just have the same legislation in Europe. I don't know why these politicians who drafted that were that creative, but it's actually something which impacts the whole world. It's not perfect. Legislation is never perfect. We're living in a democracy. It's always a compromise. And of course we can do that. And of course we need to have that as a flexible tool, because honestly, 2 years ago I would have said, I don't know what happens in 5 years. What's the status in 5 years? Today I would say, I don't know what it's at the end of this year. So things are developing that fast, and we need tools to adapt. And I think we have created something here which is not future-proofed, but as flexible as possible to adapt. And it sets the standard, which is globally one of a kind today.
Yeah, of course, as a civil rights activist, I would wish for more. I think we need, for example, we have an international ban against weapons or chemical weapons. We need that for also weapons of mass destruction in the digital area. I mean, from my point of view, it's a scandal that secret services are allowed to store security loopholes without informing the companies and using that as a backdoor. I mean, that's what criminals do, and I think we need international agreements that ban this practice in general. Or, for example, the incidents we have seen with WannaCry, which were made possible because the NSA didn't inform Microsoft before. I think these are things which are only a glimpse of that, what is possible in the future when we don't change that. So obviously there is a huge policy field connected to the whole secret service area and secret services area that is not covered by proper legislation at all. But unfortunately, I don't think that the major player, for example, the UK or the US or Russia or China would be willing to sign such a treaty. Also, the GDPR has left many questions open, which hopefully will somehow be fixed by the e-privacy regulation, but this is still not sure. So I think this is, of course, a first step and right direction and so on. But we should never stop being hungry for more, because we deserve more. Privacy is a human right and not something you can bargain with. And I often hear that privacy activists, yes, you are behaving like we live in the 80s. And I think, yeah, if you think that human rights are like 80s, then yeah, I don't want to live in your future. And but I actually think that from a very practical, everyday point of view, what you do when you fight for privacy, this is an improvement. For example, there was this case that Max Schrems sued Facebook, and he needed to go to Ireland for that, and he was looking for a lawyer. And unfortunately, all the lawyers specialized in privacy were like, oh yeah, we might have a conflict of interest. We can't work for you. And he even had a lot of money because a lot of people were donating for this case. But yeah, obviously it was not possible to find a privacy expert lawyer for this in Ireland, and he ended up having a lawyer who was specialized for asylum seekers and these kind of cases, and they ended up writing for him down what he needs to say, because they were law students from Austria, so they knew a bit about it, and yeah, but they needed an Irish lawyer. And this situation hopefully will change when we have a harmonized system in the EU, and also when we have this one-stop system, that I don't need to go to an authority in Spain when I have a case which is connected with a Spanish company, but I can go to any privacy officer or any privacy authority all over Europe, and they will take care about this case across borders.
So maybe just one last online question before the stream goes off. We've heard that many companies will not comply 100% on May 25th, but do you think that this will change quickly afterwards when they become aware of the reality of fines?
Okay, I use the words of a good friend of mine from London who consults in England on these kind of things. He always starts his speeches with "Don't panic." No, to be very clear, from my perspective, it's not about being compliant on May 25th. It's about taking care of that, having a plan, and of course, it needs to be the goal to finalize that plan as soon as possible. But what is it what we really want? Do we want to have every company thinking they are compliant because they go into a hassle now and do all the work, try to do that in 24-hour shifts, and it's not possible anymore? So my goal is more that we have companies who understand, okay, there is something going on and I have to take care, and I do that seriously and I do it after a plan. And then I personally have no problem with if they can't say I'm GDPR compliant by May 25th. Because at the end of the day, I can repeat, I can't believe that anyone can really say I'm GDPR compliant, because privacy is also something where we have to be very clear. There are the bad guys in that world. On the illegal side, they are fast, they are clever, and all the security solutions we will implement might not be 100% secure. So there is no 100% security. And on the other hand, there will be developments we don't see today. So it's not something where you can say on May 25th I make a check mark, and then for the next 2 years, I go on vacation as a DPO. No, it's have a plan, look at it, go back, look again, implement privacy by design measures. And so, yeah, I mean, most of the companies will have the goal to have something in place by early summer or by the end of the year. But it's just, I like it more if companies do it serious now and don't say we have to have all check boxes by May 25th, but do it, just do it.
If no one wants to add anything to that, I just wanted to mention that we are actually over time, which is not a bad thing, but there are still sandwiches outside, I think, and we have drinks, so if the panelists have a couple of minutes left, we can maybe proceed with our conversation in that, yeah, maybe not privately, but still in a more casual manner, if you don't mind.
Without cameras.
Without cameras, off camera, right, off the record, so to say. So if that's okay for everyone, thank you all so much. Thank everyone for coming.
Thanks for having us.
I hope we will have another discussion outside during drinks and sandwiches.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.